The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock. I found out about it at 9:53. I was sitting in the parking lot of a coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment, checking my email before heading to work, when a notification from my bank popped up. A wire transfer alert. $47,000 had been deposited into my account. I stared at it for a full 30 seconds, certain it was a mistake, a scam, some phishing attempt dressed up as good news. I didn't have $47,000. I had never had $47,000. I had a used Honda with a cracked dashboard and a savings account with enough in it to cover exactly 2 months of rent if everything went perfectly wrong. I called the bank. The representative confirmed the transfer was real. She told me the originating account belonged to a title company, Hartwell and Associates Settlement Services, and that it was labeled Proceeds Disbursement. I asked her what that meant. She told me it meant someone had used my name and my account number on a real estate closing document. That was when I drove to the title office. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. I am not a dramatic person. I do not raise my voice in public. I do not make scenes. I grew up in a house where making a scene was the worst thing you could do, worse than lying, worse than stealing, worse than anything, really, because my mother cared more about how things looked from the outside than what was rotting on the inside. 29 years of that teaches you to swallow things, to smile, to wait. I had spent my entire adult life being the kind of person who sends a polite email instead of showing up unannounced. I showed up unannounced. Hartwell and Associates was in a glass office building off Meridian Avenue, the kind of place with a waterfall in the lobby and a receptionist who looked like she had been hired specifically to make you feel underdressed. I walked in wearing my work clothes, black slacks, a gray cardigan, hair in a ponytail, and asked to speak with whoever was handling the closing for the property at 4118 Dunmore Lane. The receptionist's expression shifted just slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "But my name is on the closing documents for that property, and I didn't sign anything." She picked up her phone. The woman who came out to meet me was the supervising attorney, a tall woman named Patricia Ellison, with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair and the kind of calm that comes from decades of handling other people's crises. She introduced herself, shook my hand, and asked me to come back to her office. She did not seem surprised to see me. That, I would later understand, was because she had already noticed something was wrong. I sat down across from her desk and told her my name. I told her I had received a wire transfer from her company that morning for $47,000, and that I had no idea why. She opened a file on her desk and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Can I see your driver's license?" I handed it to her. She compared it to something in the file. The expression on her face was careful and controlled, but I saw something shift behind her eyes, the particular stillness of a person who has just confirmed something they were hoping wasn't true. "Miss Calloway," she said slowly, "when did you sign the power of attorney authorizing the sale of 4118 Dunmore Lane?" I felt the floor drop out from under me. 4118 Dunmore Lane was my mother's house, the house I grew up in, the house my grandmother had bought in 1971 and left to my mother, who had lived there for 34 years and who had, 8 months ago, had a stroke that left her with limited mobility and significant cognitive impairment. My mother, who currently lived in a memory care facility in Brookhaven, and who, on her best days, remembered my name, and on her worst days, thought I was her sister who had died in 1994. "I never signed a power of attorney," I said. Patricia Ellison closed the file. She pressed her intercom button and asked her assistant to please hold the closing that was scheduled in conference room B and to ask all parties to remain in the building. Then she looked at me again. "I think," she said, "that you need to hear what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to stay very calm." There were 2 people in conference room B waiting for that closing to happen. One of them was a real estate agent named Gary Fulton. The other one was my older sister, Diane. I should tell you about Diane, because you need to understand who she is before you can understand what she did. Diane is 6 years older than me. She is the kind of beautiful that rooms notice, the kind that gets you through doors and out of tickets and into conversations that last longer than they should. She has always known exactly how to use it. Growing up, Diane was the favorite, not in a way our mother would ever admit, but in the way that was impossible to miss, the way my mother's voice went softer when she talked to Diane, the way arguments with me ended in punishment and arguments with Diane ended in apologies. I loved my sister. I want to be honest about that too. I loved her the way you love someone you've been trained to orbit automatically, without questioning whether the orbit was doing you any good. After our mother's stroke, Diane had volunteered to handle everything. She lived closer, she said. She had more flexibility in her schedule, she said. I was working full-time and finishing a graduate program, and Diane made it very easy for me to hand over control. She set up as Mom's primary contact at the memory care facility. She managed the finances. She handled the insurance. I visited every 2 weeks, brought flowers, held my mother's hand, and trusted my sister completely. I found out in Patricia Ellison's office that Diane had filed a power of attorney document 7 months ago, giving herself complete authority over my mother's assets. She had then listed my mother's house for sale without telling me, negotiated a cash offer of $114,000, and structured the closing so that the proceeds were split between her own account and mine, presumably so that if I ever found out, she could tell me she had been trying to include me. The wire transfer I received that morning was my $47,000 share of selling a house I didn't know was being sold. Patricia Ellison explained all of this in the measured tone of a person who has seen financial elder abuse before and has learned to deliver that information without letting her own anger show through. She told me that the power of attorney document in the file bore my signature as a witness, which was fraudulent, because a witness cannot also be a beneficiary, and because I had never signed it. She told me that the buyer was real and the sale was legitimate from the buyer's perspective, but that the authorization to sell was not. She told me she was calling the police. I sat in that chair and I did not cry, which surprised me. I had expected to cry. Instead, I felt something very cold and very clear move through me, the way ice forms on still water quietly, completely, covering everything. I'd like to be there, I said, when you talk to my sister. Patricia took a breath. I can't legally stop you from being present in a common area of this building, she said. But I want you to let me do the talking. I said I understood. We walked down the hallway toward conference room B together. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see Gary Fulton scrolling through his phone, looking bored and slightly irritated. And I could see Diane, sitting with her legs crossed, wearing a cream-colored blazer, her hair down, looking the way she always looked, composed and untouchable and beautiful in the specific way that had always made people want to give her things. She looked up when the door opened. She saw Patricia Ellison first. Then she saw me. I watched her face. I watched every single thing happen to it in the space of about 2 seconds, the recognition, the calculation, the rapid recalibration of her expression into something that resembled confusion. She was good. She was genuinely, frighteningly good. But she hadn't had time to prepare for me being there, and so for those 2 seconds, before the mask came back up, I saw the truth. She knew exactly what she had done. Diane, Patricia Ellison said, setting a folder on the table, I need to ask you a few questions before we proceed. Of course, Diane said, and her voice was warm and completely steady. Is there a problem? There are some concerns about the authorization documents. Patricia opened the folder. Specifically, the power of attorney filed on behalf of your mother. Can you walk me through when this was executed? Diane explained, calmly and in detail, that our mother had signed the document in October at the memory care facility in the presence of a notary. She said our mother had been having a good week and had understood everything she was signing. She said she had included me as a witness because she wanted the process to be a family matter. Patricia let her finish. Then she slid a document across the table. This is the signature page. Can you tell me who witnessed your mother's signature? Diane looked at the page. My sister, Katie. And when did Katie witness this document? In October. I told you. Katie, Patricia said, would you like to tell your sister where you were in October? I had been in Portland, Oregon for 3 weeks in October, attending a research conference. I had the flight records, the hotel receipts, the conference registration, and 37 time-stamped photos on my phone. I had not been in Georgia in October. I had not seen my mother in October because Diane had told me, in a text message I still had, that Mom was having a bad stretch, and the facility recommended limiting visitors. I told Diane all of this. quietly, without raising my voice. The room was very still. Gary Fulton had put down his phone. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Then she did something I had not expected. She shifted, not to denial, but to justification. Her voice changed, went lower, more urgent, and she leaned slightly forward and said, "Katie, Mom is never going to use that house again. You know that. The facility costs $11,000 a month. The money has to come from somewhere. I was trying to protect what's left before it all gets eaten up by..." "By what?" I said. "By her care? I was going to tell you. You wired me $47,000 at 9:53 this morning. The closing was at 10. She didn't say anything. You weren't going to tell me," I said. "You were going to hand me money after the fact and call it a share and dare me to make it into something bigger than it already was. Because that's what you do. You put me in positions where saying something means I'm the difficult one." The door opened. 2 police officers came in, followed by a detective in plainclothes who introduced himself and explained that Patricia Ellison had placed a call and that they would need everyone to remain while they reviewed the documents. Diane hired an attorney before the day was over. I know this because her attorney called me 3 days later and told me that Diane was prepared to offer a settlement, the money returned, the sale unwound, a signed letter of apology if I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. I want to tell you what I thought about when I heard that offer, because it matters to understanding what I did next. I thought about the memory care facility. I thought about my mother, who in her clearest moments still asked about the garden at the Dunmore Lane house, whether the roses were coming in, whether the gutters had been cleaned before winter. I thought about the fact that my mother had spent 34 years in that house and had never, in any conversation I could remember, expressed any desire to sell it. I thought about the fact that Diane had made that decision, had made it alone, had forged my name to make it happen, had structured the money so that I would receive a share and therefore feel implicated while our mother sat in a room 20 minutes away and asked about roses. I declined the settlement. What followed took 8 months, and I will not pretend it was clean or easy, because it was neither of those things. The forged power of attorney was examined by a forensic document specialist hired by the district attorney's office, who concluded that the notarization stamp on the document had been used on a date when the notary in question, a woman named Sandra Briggs, who ran a small tax preparation business, was out of state. Sandra Briggs, when contacted, was horrified. She had not notarized any document in October. She had not met my mother or my sister. Her stamp, she told investigators, had gone missing from her office the previous September, and she had assumed she had simply misplaced it. The investigation also turned up 3 credit accounts that had been opened in my mother's name over the previous 18 months, drawing against a home equity line on the Dunmore Lane property. Diane had made payments on 2 of them to keep them current. The third had been allowed to default. The total drawn was just under $60,000. When added to the house sale proceeds that had been intended to go entirely to Diane's personal account, the math on the closing documents showed that the split to my account had been added 11 days before closing, after I happened to mention in a phone call that I was planning to look into Mom's finances more closely. The total came to just over $107,000. The district attorney filed charges on 4 counts: elder financial abuse, fraudulent execution of a power of attorney, forgery, and identity theft. The identity theft charge related to the credit accounts in my mother's name, and also to my forged witness signature, which had been used to validate the POA. Diane pleaded not guilty. Her attorney argued that our mother had capacity when the document was signed, and that the notarization irregularities were a clerical issue, not evidence of fraud. The jury did not agree. Deliberations lasted 11 hours across 2 days. The verdict came back on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting in the second row of the courtroom, behind the prosecution table, wearing a blue dress I had bought specifically for that day, not because I thought clothes mattered to the verdict, but because I had needed something to do with the week before the jury came back, and buying a dress and ironing it and deciding what shoes went with it had given me something concrete to focus on when everything else felt like it was made of smoke. Guilty on all 4 counts. Diane turned to look at me when the verdict was read. I don't know what she expected to see: satisfaction, maybe, or grief, or some version of sisterly guilt that she could use later to rewrite the story. I looked back at her. I did not look away. I had spent 29 years looking away. The judge sentenced her to 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 22 months, and ordered full restitution of $107,000 plus court costs. The conviction also triggered an automatic review of her authority over our mother's affairs, resulting in a court-appointed guardian taking over all financial and medical decisions, something that, the guardian later told me, should probably have happened much sooner. The house on Dunmore Lane did not sell. The closing was voided when the title company flagged the fraudulent authorization, and the buyer, who was genuinely just a retired teacher from Alpharetta, who had wanted a small house with a garden, graciously agreed to release the purchase agreement once the situation was explained. The house is still there, still in my mother's name, held in a properly executed trust now, managed by the court-appointed guardian with quarterly accounting that I review. I went back there in April. I had a key. I had always had a key, though I had not used it in years. I unlocked the front door and went inside and stood in the hallway and smelled the specific smell of that house old wood and something floral, whatever cleaner my mother had always used, the faint trace of the lavender sachets she kept in the closet, and I stood there for a while doing nothing in particular. Then I went out to the garden and looked at the roses. They needed work. The winter had been rough and nobody had been there to look after them, and the beds were overgrown and the canes were leggy and wild. But the root systems were old and deep and solid, the way things get when they've been in the ground long enough, and underneath all the mess, every single plant was still alive. I went back the following weekend with gardening gloves and a pair of pruning shears. I didn't know what I was doing. Exactly, I had never been the one to tend the garden. That had always been my mother's thing, but I figured out enough. I pruned back what was dead. I cleared the beds. I turned the soil. It wasn't perfect. It was probably not what my mother would have done. But I showed up, and I did the work, and sometimes that is the only thing available to you and it turns out to be enough. When I visit my mother now, which I do every week, I bring photos of the garden on my phone. On her good days, she scrolls through them slowly and tells me which ones are the David Austin varieties, and which ones her mother planted, and which ones she and my father put in the year they got married. She corrects my pruning technique, which is fair, because I have definitely been doing it wrong. She laughs sometimes. Real laughs? Surprised ones? The kind that belong to the person she was before the stroke rearranged things. She has not asked about Diane. I don't know whether she doesn't remember, or whether some part of her understands and has chosen not to say it out loud. Maybe both. The brain after a stroke is its own kind of complicated, and I have learned not to push on the doors that stay closed. What I know is this. I drove to a title office on a Tuesday morning because a number appeared in my bank account that didn't make sense. I drove there in work clothes with no plan and no attorney and no idea what I was walking into. And the thing that made the difference, the thing that Patricia Ellison had already noticed before I arrived, the thing that unraveled everything, was a date. A signature on a page that claimed I had been present in Georgia on a day when I was standing in a hotel conference room in Portland, watching someone present a paper on archival research methodology. One date. The whole structure of what my sister had built rested on that one date being accepted without question, and it wasn't. Because Patricia Ellison was careful. Because she compared things that a less thorough person might have processed and moved on from. Because the system, for once, worked the way it was supposed to. I am not naive enough to think that always happens. I know it doesn't. I know there are women who walk into rooms like that one, and nobody notices the date. Nobody pauses. The closing proceeds. And by the time anything surfaces, the money is gone and the paper trail is cold, and the person who did it is explaining to everyone who will listen that there was a misunderstanding. I know I was lucky in specific, traceable ways, but I also know that I got in the car. I know that I did not call Diane and ask for an explanation. I know that I did not wait, did not defer, did not tell myself it was probably fine or that I didn't want to make a scene. 29 years of being the person who swallows things, and on that one Tuesday morning, I didn't. I think about that sometimes. How close it came to going the other way. How many times in my life I had already turned around and gone home. My mother's roses are blooming now. Not perfectly, I still don't fully know what I'm doing, and I have made some choices with the shears that a more experienced gardener would probably wince at, but they are blooming. Pink ones along the back fence that my grandmother planted in 1978. Red ones near the porch that have been there so long the canes are thick as rope. A pale yellow one near the gate that my mother planted the spring after I was born, which she has always called mine, though I never knew how to take care of it. I know a little more now.